Jack, Ron, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond. Hello, welcome to Card Table. Alright, so last time I started talking about Volume 13, Card Sharks, and was so excited that I couldn't possibly contain it to a single video. So back for more talk of Volume 13, Card Sharks. If you want to go back and watch the previous video, all three of you who watch these videos, and if you happen to miss that one, which kind of gives you the premise, but in brief, Hannah Davis in the interstitial is investigating an anti-wild cards conspiracy, and she's interviewing various witnesses or various people who have had some brushes with this conspiracy, even if they didn't necessarily know that it was part of some larger conspiracy. But each story then is generally speaking, each story is in the first person because it's meant to be sort of the testimony of a particular character. So we get William F. Wu, who I think. So William F. Wu, who I've talked about before, he's awesome. He did a great story in Volume 8 about Lazy Dragon, and I think when I talked about Volume 8, I said that I really want William F. Wu to do the follow-up Lazy Dragon story because he's left some big questions about that character. I like that story quite a bit, and I like that character of Lazy Dragon a lot. But this story in Volume 13 it's called Till I Kissed You. It's set in the 1950s. And this one I love. I actually love it more than the Lazy Dragon story. God, I really like this one. So it's about a teenage Joker, Chinese American Joker, who very poignantly his Joker mutation is that he looks like a racial caricature of a Chinese person. With the large teeth and really squinty eyes, and his skin is kind of like tinged like cartoonishly bright yellow, like imagine sort of like probably like a Simpsons shade of skin. So right away there's this sort of kind of tragicomic sort of visual. In 1993, when Hannah Davis meets him, he's an adult, but he tells the story about when he was a teenager in the 1950s, and had this liaison with a young teenage girl, a beautiful Nat girl, who we learn, maybe I shouldn't give away the twist, but we learn that it's a character that we are somewhat familiar with from some earlier books, particularly Volume 6 is where we really saw her. And we get a really fascinating portrait of what she was like as a teenager that's very different from the adult version that we met in Volume 6, which creates all kinds of questions about what might have happened to her in the intervening 30 years between what we see in William F. Wu's story and what we see in Volume 6. And it's a very sweet story. It's very poignant. I really love the way it's written. It's really got this kind of even though it's meant to be an older guy in his 50s telling a story of his teen years, but it's got a certain teenage kind of naivete in the writing style that is really charming. We also meet the young version of a character named Troll, who is a very consistent presence in the books. I think he's actually in every book up to that point, 1 through 12. He's not in the original version of Volume 1, but Carrie Vaughn put him in her added story in Volume 1. So via the power of retconning, Troll is in all 12 books, and now he's in this one in Volume 13. But it's fun to see him as a teenager as well. Through the character of Troll, who's this 10 foot tall, or I don't remember, he's 9 foot tall maybe. He's supposed to be very, very tall, like this kind of giant green, I guess a little bit like the Hulk in a way, but just this sort of super strong, bulletproof character, and through him we get to see some action. And that's the story that I mentioned earlier about
it does this pretty big retcon and reveal about the origins of Jokertown, that it wasn't just jokers kind of gravitating towards an area where real estate was cheap. It was engineered. It was like a bit of social engineering by the Card Sharks conspiracy, buying up all this real estate, lowering the property values, so that deliberately, so that jokers would congregate there, so that they could eventually initiate this sort of mass kind of genocide and burn the whole place down. I guess it's not too much of a spoiler to say that that plan is foiled. So yeah, right off the bat, it's just a fascinating recontextualization of this Jokertown, which is this fixture of the Wild Cards universe, and this sort of dark retcon of the origins of the town. That's really pretty fascinating. And it's just got this great kind of sweet love story at the core, or one-sided love story, I guess. And yeah, it's just everything about it works. I'm a big fan of that one. And then we've got a story by Melinda Snodgrass called The Crooked Man, which is fascinating partly for the fact that it's from the point of view of Bradley Finn, the centaur Joker that Snodgrass created for Volume 5 of the series. Snodgrass is one of those authors in Wild Cards who kind of had her POV character and just used him in every book, her POV character being Dr. Tachyon. So whenever you saw Snodgrass's name, you were kind of guaranteed that Dr. Tachyon was going to be the lead character in that story, because that was her guy. And that's obvious, and that's Tachyon was a hugely consistent presence, right, all the way from Volume 1 all the way through Volume 10, at which point he was written out. And so now that he's written out, who is Snodgrass going to write about? And it turns out that for a little bit at least, Bradley Finn became her new kind of go-to POV character, which I like a lot, just because he's so different from Tachyon, so deliberately different from Tachyon. Although there is the superficial similarity in that he's another doctor who treats wildcard patients, works at the Jokertown clinic. So there is that clear parallel, but just so different in terms of his personality and his voice. And reading this story, The Crooked Man, which is not only features Bradley as the main character, but is narrated in the first person by Bradley, and it's just got this kind of wonderful kind of colloquial quality that isn't there in the Tachyon stories, because Tachyon is this kind of operatic, melodramatic, soap operatic kind of character, very, very grandiloquent, somewhat effeminate as well, and just has a lot of qualities that Bradley Finn does not. And so to suddenly see Snodgrass writing from the point of view of this much more sort of down to earth kind of regular guy, in the sense of his vernacular and sort of his view of the world, and someone who will use colloquialisms and will toss the occasional F-bomb with much more casualness than someone like Tachyon might. Just a real interesting contrast, and the story itself is just really well constructed. It involves an attempt by one of the Card Sharks to initiate a genocide of jokers, of a joker population in Kenya, and how Bradley Finn was made an unwitting accomplice to that. Set in 1985. It's really cool, and it's very cleverly constructed, I think, and I really love the writing in it, just because it's for someone who isn't too familiar. I've read a couple of Melinda Snodgrass non-Wild Cards projects, but for the most part, what I'm really familiar with from her is her Wild Cards work. And Crooked Man, when you're reading in sequence and reading all those Tachyon stories, Crooked Man just seems like such a swerve into a different voice, and it's really kind of neat to see. And it's a really well constructed story, I think, too, at the end of the day. So it's another winner. Then you've got Michael Cassutt, who, as far as his prose contributions to Wild Cards, we would have seen in Volume 4 in a very brief story about some Soviet intrigues set in 1986. During when the Soviet Union was still the Soviet Union before it had dissolved. A really short story, enjoyable one. I quite like that story, Legends, in Volume 4. But it's quick. This story by Michael Cassutt in Volume 13 is the first time we really see him in Wildcards doing like a truly full-length story, with some twists and turns to it. Legends was almost more of a vignette than a full story. And it's called Method for Reaching Extreme Altitudes, and it involves, set in 1958, involves ace pilots, ace in both senses of the word in that case, ace pilots who are also aces with powers, and they're there to test this experimental rocket, and the card sharks, because it's all aces involved, they want the project to fail. In addition to the story itself having some nice intrigue, and there's this sort of femme fatale character who's involved in the sabotage. We also get some neat little cameos. One of them is this sort of sinister cameo where one of the people at this government facility where the testing of this aircraft is taking place. There's a security man working at the government facility, and it's a young George Battle, that character having been introduced in Volume 11 as this kind of unsavory government operative. George G. Battle, who was created by John Joseph Miller. I know Miller said, I think he might have said in that same internet message group that I was talking about in the last video. And I guess the name is kind of obvious when it's pointed out, but George G. Battle is meant to be a stand-in for G. Gordon Liddy, which it's like, yeah, when you say it out loud, yeah, oh yeah, of course. But it's certainly not something I never really picked up on until Miller pointed it out. But yeah, so he's this character who's very unsavory when he's introduced in Volume 11, and now Volume 13 suggests that he's not just unsavory, but he's actually affiliated with this sort of sinister, genocidal conspiracy. Meanwhile, another cameo that's more lighthearted is we see Mark Meadows as a little kid, because his father is a military man. I can't remember for some reason I can't remember Mark Meadows' father's name, but General Meadows, I guess, or Major Meadows, or whatever his rank is, brings his little son Mark to this government facility just to show him some of the stuff and give him this tour. And so we get to see like little kid Mark Meadows, and that's a cameo that's dear to my heart because I've mentioned before that Mark Meadows is my favorite Wildcards character. But and we also see Baby Tachyon's ship, because it's established canon that the government had seized custody, or that the American government had seized Baby back when Tachyon first landed in 1946, and Tachyon didn't get the ship back until sometime in the late 70s or early 80s. So in a story set in 1958, the government would have Baby. So it turns out that Baby is sort of being stored at the same facility, and so we get a little cameo by Tachyon's living ship. So that's fun. There's a lot of fun little Easter eggs like that in Card Sharks that for the longtime fans I think are a lot of fun. So yeah, another enjoyable entry. And then from there we get Roger Zelazny, who tragically did not live too much longer than 1993. I believe he passed away in 95. So this is actually his last entry, his last Wildcards entry. Much like Snodgrass, who had her one single POV character of Tachyon for a long time, Zelazny only contributed prose to 4 Wildcards books, 1, 2, 5, and now 13. And in all 4 cases, it's all about the Sleeper, who we all love. I think I maybe met one Wildcards fan online who doesn't like the Sleeper, and I thought, come on, who doesn't like the Sleeper? But to each their own. But it's great to see Zelazny writing him one last time. We get a story set in 1951, I believe, or 1952, early on in the sleeper's life. And he confronts this psychologist named Pan Rudo, who sort of figures out a potential way for Croyd to control his power, where he's in this situation where every time he goes to sleep, he doesn't know what he's going to wake up looking like or what power he's going to have. And Rudo kind of figures out that there might be a way to use hypnotic suggestion to actually control it, where Croyd can decide what he'll look like when he wakes up and what power he'll have. And it works, but then Rudo kind of betrays him, and it turns out that Rudo is part of this card sharks conspiracy. And once Rudo is out of the picture, Croyd can't do it on his own, and so that's why, even though Croyd found out this way to control his power in the 50s, it didn't last, which is why the Croyd that we know and love in the present day still can't control it. And it's Zelazny, so of course it's very entertaining. It's got some great dialogue in it. So it's a good story, and Pan Rudo ends up being an important villain. It's sort of established that he's not necessarily the head card shark in 1951 when he meets Croyd in this flashback. But when we meet the Pan Rudo of 1993, in the present day story, it starts to become clear that he's risen to the top, and he's sort of like card shark numero uno in the present day. So he ends up being kind of the big bad of the card sharks triad overall. So it's cool that Zelazny gets to sort of take one of the very earliest wild cards protagonists and sort of make him kind of the arch enemy of Pan Rudo, who's sort of like the first wild cards protagonist gets to be the antithesis to the last major wild cards antagonist of those first 15 books before the relaunch. So a little alpha and omega kind of a loop sort of scenario that I find quite aesthetically pleasing. That takes me to Victor Milan's story, A Wind from Khorasan, which I know I've already said that Vic Milan is my favorite wildcards contributor, and so it's gonna sound like a gimme when I say that Wind from Khorasan is my favorite story in this book. But again, what came first? Do I love all these Vic Milan stories because he's my favorite, or is he my favorite because there's all these stories that he wrote that I love? The ranking had to come from somewhere. So, Wind from Khorasan. It's actually it's hard to pick one favorite wildcard story. I mean, when there's 30 books, but I have said before in conversation with other wildcards fans that if I had to pick one favorite wildcard story, just of all 30 books, one favorite story, it would be A Wind from Khorasan. Because man, it's cool. So this one, the seeds of this one are actually right in the very first book, in this kind of essentially a throwaway line about the Iran hostage crisis of 1980. There's a line about how Jimmy Carter sent a team of aces to try and rescue the hostages, and that attempt failed. I remember reading an online review where they talked about how what a wasted opportunity, because in the real world the attempts to get the hostages failed. So why not make this in this alternate reality where there are superheroes? You could have changed things so that the rescue attempt succeeded. Which, yeah, I guess, but trust the wildcards authors. That's what I've learned. You got to trust the authors. They know what they're doing, because that throwaway line just creates the question, right, of why did it fail? Why did a team of superpowered aces? Why was that not enough to rescue these hostages? And so in volume four, there's actually another real brief. It's not just one line, but it is just like one scene that again is almost throwaway. I mean, it's so brief, but where they talk about that whole situation with the Iran team, and how the government never released the names of the aces who were involved. But there's a little bit where they talk about the character of Lady Black. It's implied that she was there. It's implied that Cyclone was there. When they ask Carnifex if he was part of that mission, he says, no, if I had been part of it, we wouldn't have failed. And so, and that's part of that interstitial, that Journal of Xavier Desmond. And so, what I love, so at the end of Volume 4, there's a bit about how Xavier Desmond has arranged that after he dies, his journal's going to be published. The Journal of Xavier Desmond will then be a book that exists in the Wildcards universe. And I can't remember, somewhere after Volume 4, it is confirmed that, yes, that book was published. I can't remember which volume it is, but maybe Volume 11. I feel like Tom Tudbury, the turtle, maybe has a copy of it on a shelf or something. So that might be Volume 11. But anyway, so Vic Milan with his, I mentioned in Volume 12, he introduces the mechanic, who's his Mary Sue author insertion character, the guy who's just good at everything. He tells the story about how he led this mission to Iran, and there's this great little, and so Carnifex is there. So he was just, it was kayfabe, as they say. He was he was lying when he said, he just didn't want to admit that he was part of a failed mission. So he was lying when he said, no, if I'd have been part of it, we would have succeeded. So Carnifex was there, Lady Black was there, Cyclone was not. And so Vic Milan has the mechanic, as he's telling the story, he has this little aside where he says, yeah, look, I read the Journal of Xavier Desmond, and I saw that he said that Cyclone was a part of the mission. But look, Xavier Desmond wasn't there. I was. Cyclone was not part of that mission. And that's just one of those things that's just, if you're a Wildcards continuity nerd, and I am the only one, I think, as far as I know, that's just like candy right there. to just acknowledge that little bit from that one really brief one-page scene in Volume 4 to address that little contradiction. Pretty great. So it's a 7-person team. The mechanic is there, Carnifex is there, Lady Black is there, Popinjay, aka Jay Aykroyd, is there, and then 3 other characters that are invented for that story that we've never heard of before. And of course, as we learn, the reason we haven't heard of those 3 is because those are the 3 who don't make it out. So the mission fails. 3 members of the team are killed, but we learn that it could have succeeded, and the only reason it didn't was because it was sabotaged by the card sharks, both to discredit Wildcards and there's all this business about how Jimmy Carter was kind of a pro Wildcards, sympathetic to the cause of Wildcard equality, et cetera, et cetera. So the card sharks had no love for him as a president. so they wanted to discredit Carter and to discredit this whole attempt to use aces, which dovetails with of course, there's the people are suspicious of the weird timing of how once Reagan was elected, then it suddenly became very easy to get those hostages out, and how that's a little fishy. And so I think Vic Milan is trying to take the card sharks conspiracy and kind of dovetail it with what the conspiracies that people have sort of hypothesized about what really happened with that scenario. So it's all very canny and but subtle in its way, but also in other ways not subtle at all, because it's a pretty violent little action story of the type that Vic Milan seems to really love to write, and I love to read. So definitely a favorite. Just to acknowledge that I'm not here to just only sing Vic Milan's praises and never acknowledge anything that I dislike about him or even about Wildcards. I will give this caveat, because I did mention, I think when I was talking about Double Solitaire, how I don't think anyone except George R.R. Martin can really write Jay Aykroyd funny, because one of the great things about Aykroyd as a character is how he's really witty, and he's got all this dialogue that just makes you laugh out loud, which is such a great trick, I think, as I mentioned before, to have a character to be reading a piece of prose and to have it be so funny that you laugh out loud is a real good trick. And I think Martin really pulls that off with Aykroyd, but other writers don't. When other writers write J. Aykroyd, he's just never that funny. And even Vic Milan, as much as I love him, when he writes J. Aykroyd for A Win from Coruscant, he's not that funny. It's great to have him there because he's a great character, but he's not funny. Sorry, Vic. So let's see. All right, the video's getting kind of long. I still have 2 more stories that I want to rave about. There are 2 left. So save those for next time. Thanks for watching.
So my honey and me go to a counselor to try and give our love back some sparks. He said, we'll get your love growing, but before we get going, may I highly recommend Cod Shocks? I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. Lately we've had some friction, cause my baby's hooked on shared world fiction.